December 16, 1944. The Ardennes Forest. The forest was silent in those final moments before dawn. Oberleutnant Klaus Reinhardt stood at the edge of the tree line, his breath forming clouds in the frozen air. Behind him, concealed beneath the snow-laden pines, waited an entire battalion of the 12th SS Panzer Division, Hitlerjugend. Tanks, half-tracks, and over 800 men prepared for what their commanders promised would be Germany's greatest counteroffensive since the fall of France. Klaus had been fighting since Poland in 1939. He'd survived the frozen hell of the Eastern Front, the retreat through Ukraine, and the desperate defense of France. At 24, he was already considered a veteran, his face lined beyond his years, his eyes carrying that distant look common to men who'd seen too much death. "Herr Oberleutnant," whispered Unteroffizier Werner Hoffmann, appearing at his side. "The men are ready. They're asking when we move." Klaus checked his watch. 0530 hours. Operation Wacht am Rhein, Watch on the Rhine, was about to begin. Hitler's desperate gamble to split the Allied armies, capture Antwerp, and force the Western powers to negotiate peace. It was audacious. It was insane. And yet, standing here with hundreds of thousands of German soldiers, poised to strike along an 80-mile front, Klaus felt something he hadn't experienced in years: hope. "We move with the barrage," he said quietly. "Tell the men to stay warm. It won't be long now." Hoffmann nodded and melted back into the darkness. Klaus remained at his position, studying the American lines across the valley. The 106th Infantry Division held this sector, green troops, fresh from America, with barely any combat experience. Intelligence suggested they were spread thin, unprepared for a major assault. The Americans had grown complacent, believing the war was nearly won. They were about to learn otherwise. At precisely 0530, the world exploded. Over 1,600 German artillery pieces opened fire simultaneously along the entire front. The sound was apocalyptic, a continuous thunder that shook snow from the trees and made the ground tremble beneath Klaus's boots. He watched as the American positions across the valley disappeared in a forest of explosions, orange flames blossoming against the pre-dawn darkness. "Los! Los! Forward!" The order came down the line. Klaus drew his pistol and moved forward, his men emerging from the forest behind him like gray wolves. The tanks rumbled to life, their engines roaring, tracks crunching through the snow. All along the front, the German army surged forward, 29 divisions strong, the largest force Germany had assembled in the West since 1940. The initial assault was everything they'd hoped for. The American lines, battered by the artillery barrage and overwhelmed by the sheer mass of the German attack, began to collapse. Klaus's battalion pushed through the first defensive positions with minimal resistance. By midday, they'd advanced 3 miles, capturing hundreds of bewildered American soldiers who stumbled from their foxholes with their hands raised. "It's working," Hoffmann said, his face flushed with excitement as they regrouped near a captured American supply depot. "Herr Oberleutnant, it's actually working." Klaus wanted to share his subordinates' enthusiasm, but something troubled him. The Americans were retreating, yes, but in good order. And more concerning, their artillery fire was intensifying despite falling back. He could hear it now, the distinctive crack of American guns echoing through the valleys, and the explosions seemed unusually effective, catching German formations in the open with devastating accuracy. "Don't celebrate yet," Klaus cautioned. "We've barely begun." December 18th, 1944. Third day of the offensive. By the third day, the German advance had begun to slow. The weather, which had initially favored the attackers by grounding Allied aircraft, remained overcast. But American resistance was stiffening. More troubling were the reports Klaus kept hearing from other units along the front. Entire platoons wiped out, Captain Heinrich Vogel told him during a brief meeting at divisional headquarters. Vogel commanded a company in the neighboring regiment, a hard man from the Eastern Front with a scar running from his eye to his jaw. Not just casualties, annihilated. "I saw it myself yesterday. A full platoon advancing across open ground. American artillery opened up. And I'm telling you, Klaus, I've never seen anything like it. The shells were exploding in the air, maybe 20 meters above the ground, showering shrapnel down on the men. There was nowhere to hide. Within 2 minutes, 40 men were down. 40 men. Klaus frowned. "Artillery airburst? That's nothing new, Heinrich. We've been doing that ourselves since—" "No, you don't understand." Vogel leaned closer, his voice dropping. "These weren't timed fuses. The shells exploded at precisely the right altitude, every single one of them. No ground impacts, no early detonations. Perfect height, perfect timing, every single shell. How is that possible?" Klaus had no answer. Variable time fuses were notoriously unreliable, requiring precise calculation and adjustment for each shot. Even the most experienced artillery crews couldn't achieve consistent airburst patterns. Yet Vogel wasn't the type to exaggerate. "Maybe we were just unlucky," Klaus suggested, though he didn't believe it himself. "Unlucky?" Vogel laughed bitterly. "I've heard similar reports from at least a dozen other units. Something is different about their artillery, Klaus. Something we don't understand." That evening, Klaus experienced it himself. His battalion was advancing through a snow-covered field toward the town of St. Vith, one of the key objectives in the northern sector of the offensive. American forces had been driven from the town earlier that day, but they were counterattacking, trying to retake the critical road junction. Klaus's men were crossing open ground, moving as quickly as possible to reach the cover of a tree line on the far side of the field. He heard the whistle first, that distinctive incoming shriek that every soldier learned to recognize and fear. "Incoming!" he shouted, diving for the snow. But there was nowhere to go. The field was completely open, flat and featureless. His men dropped prone, trying to press themselves into the earth. But Klaus knew it wouldn't matter. Artillery in open ground was a death sentence unless you were incredibly lucky. The first shells arrived, but instead of the usual pattern of explosions, some shells hitting the ground and throwing up geysers of dirt, others detonating too high to be effective, a few lucky hits catching men in their blast radius, something entirely different happened. Every single shell exploded at exactly the same height above the ground, perhaps 20 meters up. The air above the field suddenly filled with thunder and fire, a perfect canopy of death. And then the shrapnel came down. Klaus pressed his face into the snow, feeling the hot metal fragments whipping overhead, hearing them hiss as they buried themselves in the ground around him. Screams erupted across the field. Men were being torn apart by invisible blades falling from the sky. There was no pattern, no safe spot. The entire field was being scoured by a metal rain that left no shelter. It lasted perhaps 30 seconds. When the barrage lifted, Klaus slowly raised his head, his ears ringing. The field was a slaughterhouse. Bodies lay everywhere, torn and bleeding. Men writhed in the snow, crying for medics. Of the 80 men who'd started across the field, Klaus estimated at least 30 were dead or dying, with another 20 wounded badly enough to need immediate evacuation. Half his company gone in half a minute. "Mein Gott," Hoffman whispered beside him, his face white with shock. The young Unteroffizier had survived the barrage by pure chance, landing in a slight depression that had shielded him from the worst of the shrapnel. "What was that? What did they hit us with?" Klaus had no answer. He'd been shelled hundreds of times during the war, but never like this. This was something new, something terrifyingly effective. "Get the wounded," he ordered, his voice sounding hollow in his own ears. "We need to pull back to the tree line. Now, before they fire again." December 19, 1944. Divisional Headquarters. The next morning, Klaus was summoned to Divisional Headquarters along with several other company commanders. The meeting was held in a requisitioned Belgian farmhouse, the rooms crowded with officers studying maps and arguing over radio reports. Oberst Werner Müller, their regimental commander, stood before a map of the Ardennes, his expression grim. Müller was a professional soldier from the old army, a man who'd served in the First War and built his career on competence rather than ideology. Klaus respected him. "Gentlemen," Müller began without preamble, "we need to discuss the American artillery." The room fell silent. Every man present had experienced or heard about the devastating effectiveness of American fire over the past few days. "As of this morning," Müller continued, "we've suffered over 40% casualties in some battalions, with the majority coming from artillery fire. This is unsustainable. Intelligence has been collecting reports from across the entire offensive front, and the pattern is consistent. American artillery is achieving kill rates 3 to 4 times higher than anything we've encountered previously." He paused, letting that sink in. "Our artillery experts have analyzed the pattern of American shell bursts, and they've reached a disturbing conclusion. The Americans have developed some kind of new fuse that allows their shells to detonate at the optimal height above ground level without requiring pre-calculation or adjustment. Every shell, every time, perfectly timed." "How is that possible?" someone asked. "We don't know," Mueller admitted. "Our scientists say it shouldn't be possible with current technology. The timing required is too precise, measured in microseconds. And yet it's happening. Every American artillery unit appears to have access to this new weapon." Klaus thought about the carnage in the field, the perfect canopy of explosions. "Sir, if they can do this over the entire front, how can we continue the offensive? Any advance across open ground will be suicide." Miller's expression grew even grimmer. "That is precisely the problem we're facing. The offensive depended on speed, on breaking through before the Americans could bring their full strength to bear. But we're being slowed at every turn, and this new weapon is the primary cause." "What are our orders?" asked Captain Vogel. "We continue the attack," Miller said flatly. "The Fuhrer has demanded that we reach the Meuse River at all costs. We will advance, regardless of casualties." The room erupted in protest. These were hardened officers, men who'd sent thousands of soldiers to their deaths over the years, but even they could see the madness in this order. Miller raised his hand for silence. I don't like it any more than you do, but we have our orders. However, I will tell you this. Change your tactics. No more massed formations in open ground. Use cover whenever possible. Move at night. Spread out your units. Make yourselves harder targets. And if we can't avoid open ground, Klaus asked. Miller met his eyes. Then move fast and pray. December 20th, 1944. The approach to Bastogne. The German offensive was beginning to fragment into separate thrusts as American resistance stiffened. Klaus's battalion had been redirected south as part of the drive toward Bastogne, a critical road junction that the Americans were desperately trying to hold. If Bastogne fell, the entire southern shoulder of the American defense would collapse. They were advancing through rolling, forested terrain, trying to avoid open areas as much as possible. But warfare doesn't allow you to always choose your ground. Eventually, you have to cross that field, climb that hill, traverse that valley. And whenever they did, the American artillery found them. Klaus was beginning to understand the full horror of what they faced. The proximity fuse, though he didn't know that name yet, eliminated the oldest defense against artillery, the foxhole. Throughout military history, soldiers had dug in to protect themselves from bombardment. A shell that hit the ground expended most of its energy into the earth, with the shrapnel radiating outward in a relatively limited pattern. A soldier in a trench or foxhole had a good chance of survival, but these new American shells exploded above the ground, raining death straight down into defensive positions. Trenches and foxholes offered almost no protection. The only safety was to be under thick overhead cover, a building, a bunker, a dense forest canopy, and those weren't always available. The psychological impact was devastating. Soldiers who'd endured artillery barrages for years were suddenly terrified of open ground. Men refused orders to advance. Officers had to drive their troops forward at gunpoint. The casualties mounted steadily, not in single catastrophic battles, but in a grinding, continuous hemorrhage that was bleeding the German army white. On the evening of December 20th, Klaus's battalion was ordered to support an assault on an American position, blocking the road to Bastogne. The position was held by elements of the 101st Airborne Division, paratroopers who'd been rushed to Bastogne just days earlier. They were dug in on a forested ridge, with clear fields of fire covering the approach. "We attack at first light," Miller told his officers during the briefing. "The SS Panzer Division will lead, with our regiment in support. Once we break through here, the road to Bastogne is open." Klaus studied the terrain. The approach to the American position required crossing nearly a kilometer of open ground, gentle rolling hills covered in snow, with virtually no cover. In the failing light, he could see the American positions on the ridge, dark shapes against the white snow. "Sir," he said carefully, "that's a killing ground. If their artillery catches us in the open—" "I'm aware of the risks, Oberleutnant," Miller cut him off. "But we have no choice. The attack goes forward as ordered." That night, Klaus sat with his men in a commandeered barn, trying to prepare them for what was coming. They were scared. He could see it in their faces. These weren't the enthusiastic volunteers of 1939, or even the hardened veterans of 1942. These were tired, frightened men who'd seen too many of their comrades cut down by an enemy they couldn't fight. "Will it be like the field near St. Vith?" asked Gefreiter Paul Schmidt, a boy of 19 who looked 14. He joined the unit just a week before the offensive began. "I don't know, Paul," Klaus answered honestly. "But whatever happens, stay spread out, don't bunch up, and move fast. Speed is our best protection now." "Are we going to die tomorrow, Herr Oberleutnant?" The question came from another young soldier, his voice barely above a whisper. Klaus looked around at the faces watching him, boys, most of them, sent to fight a war that was already lost. He could lie to them, tell them everything would be fine, that they'd survive, but they deserved better than comfortable lies. "Some of us probably will," he said quietly. "That's the truth. But if we're smart and we're lucky, most of us will make it through. Stay alert, follow orders, look out for each other. That's all we can do." The barn fell silent. Outside, snow began to fall again, the flakes drifting past the open door. Somewhere in the distance, artillery rumbled. Impossible to tell if it was German or American. Hoffman appeared at Klaus's elbow. "Sir, you should get some rest. Tomorrow will be—" He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. "You too, Werner," Klaus said. "We'll need every man sharp tomorrow." But Klaus didn't sleep that night. He sat in the barn doorway, smoking one of the American cigarettes they'd captured from a supply dump, watching the snow fall and thinking about all the men he'd led into battle over the years. How many had he lost? He'd stopped counting somewhere in Russia. At some point, the numbers became meaningless, just statistics in a war that ground men into dust. He thought about his family in Hamburg, his mother and sister, if they were still alive. He hadn't heard from them in months. The last letter had described the Allied bombing raids, the city burning, food running short. Were they even still there? Or had they joined the millions of German refugees fleeing westward? And what was he fighting for now? Germany was going to lose this war. Any honest soldier could see that. The Russians were approaching the German border from the east. The British and Americans controlled the skies. And yet here he was, preparing to lead men across a field of fire for objectives that didn't matter, in an offensive that couldn't succeed. But orders were orders, and tomorrow he would do his duty, just as he always had. December 21st, 1944. The attack. The attack began at 0600 under a sky that remained stubbornly overcast. The Luftwaffe had promised air support, but Klaus knew better than to count on it. The German Air Force was a shadow of its former self, its planes destroyed or grounded by lack of fuel. The SS Panzer troops went first, advancing in a wedge formation with tanks in the lead and infantry following. Klaus's battalion waited in reserve, watching as the assault force moved out across the snow-covered fields toward the American position. For the first few minutes, everything was quiet. The Germans advanced steadily, their tanks churning up snow, the infantry moving in loose formations, just as they'd been trained. Maybe the Americans had withdrawn during the night. Maybe the ridge exploded. American artillery opened up with devastating precision. The shells came down in a perfect pattern, each one detonating at exactly the same height above the ground. The advancing German formation disappeared into a storm of fire and steel. Klaus watched through his binoculars as men were torn apart. Tanks halted as their commanders were killed, chaos spreading through the assault force. "My God," Hoffman breathed beside him, but the attack didn't stop. More German troops poured forward, trying to maintain momentum, trying to close with the American positions. Before the artillery could destroy them completely, some units made it halfway across the field before being caught by another barrage. Others broke and ran, falling back in disorder. Then came the order Klaus had been dreading. "Regiment Reinhardt, advance! Support the attack! Los, move out!" Klaus shouted, his voice carrying across the company. His men emerged from their positions and began moving forward, spreading out as much as possible, running toward the killing ground ahead. Klaus ran with them, his lungs burning in the cold air, his boots slipping in the snow. Ahead, he could see the wreckage of the SS assault, burning tanks, bodies scattered across the white field, wounded men crawling for cover that didn't exist. The whistle of incoming shells made his blood freeze. "Down!" he screamed, throwing himself flat. The barrage was perfect. Every shell exploded at exactly the same height, creating an umbrella of death that swept across the field. Klaus pressed himself into the snow, feeling shrapnel whip overhead, hearing the screams of men being hit all around him. When it lifted, he raised his head and looked around. His company was shattered, bodies everywhere, men screaming for medics who couldn't reach them. The attack had failed before it truly began. "Fall back," the order came down the line. "All units, fall back!" Klaus grabbed the nearest man, Gefreiter Schmidt, the boy who'd asked if they were going to die. He was still alive, his eyes wide with shock. "Move! Back to the tree line! Go!" The survivors stumbled back across the field, running through the snow, expecting another barrage at any moment, but the American guns remained silent. They didn't need to fire again. The attack had been shattered. Klaus counted his men when they reached the relative safety of the forest. Of the 80 men he'd led forward, 43 remained, 37 casualties in less than 10 minutes, and they'd never even gotten close to the American positions. Hoffman was alive, his uniform torn and bloodstained, but moving under his own power. Vogel from the neighboring company was being carried back on a stretcher, unconscious, his left arm gone at the shoulder. The SS battalion that had led the attack had effectively ceased to exist. Müller appeared through the trees, his face gray with exhaustion and rage. "Reform your units," he ordered. "We attack again in 1 hour." "Sir," Klaus protested, "my men are—" "In 1 hour, Oberleutnant," Müller snapped. "Those are the orders from division. We attack until we break through, regardless of cost." Klaus wanted to argue, wanted to tell his commander that this was suicide, that they were throwing away lives for nothing. But he was a German officer, and German officers followed orders. "Jawohl, Herr Oberst," he said quietly. The second attack failed as completely as the first. The third attack, launched in the afternoon, didn't even make it halfway across the field before being driven back. By evening, Klaus's battalion had been reduced to fewer than 200 effective soldiers. The casualties were over 60%. That night, they received new orders. The attack on this sector was being called off. They would withdraw and regroup for operations elsewhere. Klaus sat in the command post, a dugout hastily carved into a hillside, and tried to write a report on the day's action. But what could he say? That they'd been slaughtered? That the Americans had a weapon against which they had no defense? That the offensive was failing? "We're losing," Hoffman said quietly. The young Unteroffizier sat nearby, cleaning his rifle with mechanical precision. His hands were shaking. "Yes," Klaus agreed. There was no point in lying, not anymore. "Then why are we still fighting?" "Because we're soldiers," Klaus said, "and soldiers follow orders." even stupid ones. Hoffman looked up at him. Is that enough? Just following orders? Klaus had no answer to that question. December 24th, 1944, Christmas Eve. The weather cleared on December 24th. For the Germans, it was a disaster. Allied aircraft filled the skies. Fighters, bombers, reconnaissance planes. They attacked anything that moved, shooting up columns, destroying supply depots, strafing troops in the open. German formations that had been advancing steadily suddenly found themselves pinned down, unable to move during daylight hours. Combined with the devastating effectiveness of American artillery, the German offensive ground to a halt. Some units had reached within a few miles of the Meuse River, tantalizingly close to their objective, but they could go no further. They were out of fuel, out of ammunition, and most critically, running out of men. Klaus's battalion had been pulled back to a defensive position near the town of Houffalize. They were down to 120 men, less than a quarter of their starting strength. Most of the casualties had come from artillery fire, specifically from those damn proximity-fused shells that exploded at the perfect height every single time. It was Christmas Eve, but there was no celebration in the German positions. The men sat in their foxholes and dugouts, shivering in the cold, smoking captured American cigarettes, and waiting for orders that everyone knew would eventually come: withdraw. Klaus sat with Hoffman and the surviving officers of the battalion, sharing a bottle of schnapps someone had found in an abandoned house. They didn't talk much. What was there to say? "Do you think they'll let us surrender?" asked Lieutenant Fischer, one of the platoon commanders. He was 22, looked 40, and had lost his entire platoon in the fighting around Bastogne. "The Americans, I mean, when this is over." "Maybe," Klaus said. "If we're lucky." "I heard they're shooting SS prisoners," Fischer continued. "After Malmedy, that had been a disaster. SS troops had massacred American prisoners during the opening days of the offensive, and news of the atrocity had spread throughout both armies. Now American troops were less inclined to take SS prisoners alive. "We're not SS," Hoffman pointed out. "We're regular army. They'll treat us according to the Geneva Convention." "Assuming they're in a mood to follow it," Fischer said darkly. Klaus changed the subject. "Do you hear that?" They fell silent, listening. From somewhere in the distance came the sound of singing. American soldiers, celebrating Christmas in their positions. The sound drifted across the frozen battlefield, incongruous and surreal. Silent night, holy night. "They're singing Christmas carols," Hoffman said wonderingly. In the middle of a war, Klaus listened to the distant voices and felt something break inside him. This was madness. All of it. Men killing each other with increasingly efficient weapons on a holiday that was supposed to celebrate peace and brotherhood. And for what? For Hitler's delusions? For territory that would be lost again in a few months? "I'm tired," he said quietly. "I'm so tired of this war." No one disagreed with him. December 26th, 1944. The counterattack. 2 days after Christmas, the Americans counterattacked. Patton's Third Army had wheeled north from their positions in France and smashed into the southern flank of the German salient. With clear weather allowing full Allied air support, and with artillery that could strike with unprecedented accuracy, the American assault was devastating. Klaus's battalion was caught in the path of the counterattack. They'd been holding a defensive position along a ridgeline, but American forces punched through their neighboring units and threatened to encircle them. The order came to withdraw, but it was already too late. American artillery had bracketed every escape route, and those proximity-fused shells made retreat across open ground virtually impossible. "We're trapped," Hoffman said, looking at the map. "Every road out is under fire." Klaus studied their position. They were in a small village, with perhaps 100 men left. The Americans were closing in from 3 sides. Their ammunition was running low. They had no anti-tank weapons. And overhead, American fighter bombers circled like vultures. "We could surrender," Fischer suggested. The officers looked at each other. A few weeks ago, that suggestion would have been unthinkable. German officers didn't surrender unless there was absolutely no alternative. But things had changed. The offensive had failed. The war was lost. And these proximity-fused shells had made it clear that continuing to fight was just going to get more men killed for no purpose. "All right," Klaus said finally, "but we do it properly. White flag, weapons laid down, no tricks. The men have been through enough." They sent Gefreiter Schmidt forward with a white sheet tied to a pole. The Americans held their fire. Within an hour, Klaus found himself standing in a snowy courtyard, his hands raised, watching as American soldiers moved through the village to secure it. An American captain approached. Young, probably no older than Klaus, with the look of someone who'd also seen too much combat. "You speak English?" he asked. "Some, yes," Klaus replied. His English was rusty but functional. "You're the commander here?" "I am. Oberleutnant Klaus Reinhardt, 12th SS Panzer Division." The American captain's expression hardened at the mention of SS, but he nodded. "You and your men will be processed as prisoners of war. You'll be treated according to the Geneva Convention. But I need to know, are there any wounded in the village?" "Several," Klaus said. We've been caring for them as best we could. Show me. Klaus led the American captain to the makeshift aid station they'd set up in a cellar. A dozen wounded German soldiers lay on the floor, bandaged with whatever materials they'd been able to find. The American looked at them for a moment, then turned to one of his sergeants. Get our medics down here. These men need proper treatment. Klaus felt something loosen in his chest. Thank you, he said quietly. The captain looked at him. Don't thank me. Just be glad you surrendered when you did. Another few hours and we would have had to assault this position. Would have been a lot messier. Your artillery, Klaus said. The shells that explode in the air. What are they? The captain smiled grimly. That's classified information, Oberleutnant, but I can tell you this. They're the reason you guys aren't going to win this war. You can't dig in against them. Can't hide from them. They're the most effective anti-personnel weapon ever developed. How do they work? Like I said, classified. But here's the thing. We've got hundreds of thousands of them. Every artillery battery in the European theater has them, and you've got no defense against them. The captain paused. You fought well, Oberleutnant, but you were fighting against a weapon you couldn't counter. No shame in surrendering under those circumstances. Klaus thought about all the men he'd lost over the past 10 days. Men torn apart by shrapnel raining from the sky. Men killed in open ground where they should have been safe. Men who died because their enemy had developed a weapon that changed the fundamental calculus of warfare. No, he said quietly. No shame, just sadness. Epilogue. January 1945. Prisoner of war camp. Franz Klaus sat in the barracks of the POW camp, a converted French military installation, now housing thousands of captured German soldiers. Through the window he could see snow falling. It had been a brutal winter, the worst in decades, and it showed no signs of letting up. He'd been a prisoner for 3 weeks now. The Americans treated them reasonably well, better than the Germans had treated many of their prisoners, if he was honest with himself. They had food, shelter, and medical care. They were alive, which was more than could be said for millions of their comrades. Other prisoners had begun to arrive from the Ardennes, bringing news of the offensive's complete collapse. The Germans had been pushed back to their starting positions. All the ground they'd gained had been lost. Tens of thousands of soldiers were dead or captured. The war in the West was effectively over. One evening, Klaus found himself in conversation with a captured German artillery officer, a Hauptmann named Weber, who'd been involved in trying to analyze American artillery tactics during the battle. I finally found out what they were, Weber said, his voice carrying a mixture of respect and bitterness. The Americans called them proximity fuses. They had a tiny radio transmitter in each shell. As the shell fell toward the ground, the radio waves would bounce back from the earth. When the shell reached the optimal height, about 70 feet, the reflected signal would trigger the fuse and detonate the shell. Klaus stared at him. A radio in each shell? That's impossible. The forces of firing would destroy any electronics. That's what we thought, Weber agreed. But the Americans figured it out. Miniaturized tubes that could survive the acceleration, sealed in a way that protected them from the forces. They started developing them back in 1940, had them in production by 1943. We had no idea such a weapon even existed until we started encountering them. How many did they use? During the Battle of the Bulge, intelligence estimates somewhere around 20 million proximity fuse shells were fired by American artillery. 20 million, Klaus. Every single one detonating at the perfect height to maximize casualties against troops in the open or in field fortifications. Klaus tried to wrap his mind around that number. 20 million shells, each one a marvel of engineering, each one capable of killing or wounding multiple soldiers. No wonder the offensive had failed. No wonder entire formations had been wiped out. We never had a chance, did we? He said quietly. Weber shook his head. Not once they deployed those fuses. Combined with their air superiority, their armor, their supplies, we were fighting a 20th century war with 19th century tactics. And that weapon, those proximity fuses, they made it impossible to mass troops for an assault, impossible to hold defensive positions in the open, impossible to conduct operations the way we've been trained. It was like, he paused, searching for words. It was like bringing swords to a gunfight. Klaus thought about all the men he'd lost. Good soldiers, brave men who'd followed orders and done their duty. They died not because they'd failed, not because they'd been cowardly or incompetent, but because their enemy had developed a weapon against which they had no defense. Outside, the snow continued to fall, covering the earth in white. In a few months, spring would come, the war would end, and Klaus Reinhardt, if he lived that long, would have to find a way to live with what he'd seen and done. But for now, he was just a prisoner, waiting for a future he couldn't predict, haunted by a past he couldn't forget, and marked forever by the battle where technology had changed warfare and condemned an entire generation to death by invisible weapons they could neither see nor counter. The Battle of the Bulge would go down in history as Germany's last major offensive of the war. But for Klaus and the survivors, it would always be remembered as the battle where the sky itself became the enemy, where shells exploded with perfect precision, and where an entire army learned that courage and skill were no longer enough to overcome the weapons of modern war. The age of the proximity fuse had arrived, and warfare would never be the same again.